Welcome to Learn English Through History. Take a slow, deep breath. Relax your shoulders. Today, we travel back in time to discover a quiet invention that changed our entire world. Look at your phone, your computer, or the clock on your wall. Every digital screen around you runs on one simple foundation: numbers. But thousands of years ago, even basic arithmetic was a heavy burden. Picture a merchant in a busy marketplace 2,000 years ago. A merchant is a person who buys and sells goods to earn a living. Around your stall sit sacks of grain, clay jars of olive oil, and bundles of wool. Customers stop by all day long. You must record what you sold and count what you earned. To do that, you reach for a slab of clay or a wooden board coated in dark wax. In ancient Europe, people wrote with Roman numerals. For the number 1, you carved the letter I. 5 was V, 10 was X, 100 became C, and 1,000 was M. Writing a year like 1888 meant carving MDCCCLXXXVIII. That is 13 separate letters just to write one single number. Try multiplying that number by 50. Doing that by hand was nearly impossible. Ancient traders did not calculate on parchment. Instead, they relied on a counting board. A counting board is a flat wooden table marked with lines, where you slide small stones or beads back and forth. You moved those pebbles up and down to add and subtract. Without your counting board, business stopped. At the end of every season, a merchant faced tall stacks of marked tablets. Calculating a full year of profit took days of grinding effort, and one small error could ruin an entire enterprise. Why was simple math so difficult? Ancient Greek and Roman scholars had a blind spot in their thinking. They had no placeholder. A placeholder is a symbol that holds an empty position so you understand the true value of neighboring digits. Consider the modern number 105. The digit 1 represents 100. The digit 5 represents 5 single units. Sitting quietly between them is a round 0. That 0 tells your eyes there are no tens. Without that open circle, the number becomes 15. A tiny missing mark changes everything. For centuries, Western thinkers refused to treat nothing as a number. In ancient Greece, famous philosophers argued that nothingness was unnatural and dangerous. A philosopher is someone who studies deep questions about life, knowledge, and reality. To them, how could nothing be something? When a clay bowl is empty, you do not count the emptiness. You only count the figs or olives resting inside. Because they feared the void, their mathematics remained locked in cumbersome letters and heavy stone boards. The void means completely empty space. But thousands of miles to the east, across the river valleys of ancient India, scholars looked at the universe with different eyes. They did not fear the empty space. They welcomed it. The roots of this quiet revolution were hidden underground for centuries, recorded on fragile sheets of tree bark. In the year 1881, a farmer was digging through dry soil near Bakhshali, a small village in what is now Pakistan. His metal spade struck a buried stone chamber several feet down. Resting inside that cold, dark pocket, wrapped in decaying cloth, was a fragile bundle of ancient leaves. They were dark, brittle, and covered in fine lines of handwritten script. These leaves came from birch bark. Birch bark is the thin, tough outer skin of a birch tree that ancient scholars used in place of paper. Scribes had written across these sheets with deep black ink made from soot and oil. A scribe is a person whose profession is writing or copying manuscripts by hand. Scholars carefully gathered the brittle leaves and sent them to England. Eventually, the document entered the Bodleian libraries at the University of Oxford, where it became known as the Bakhshali Manuscript. A manuscript is an old document written entirely by hand before printing presses existed. Historians recognize the text as an ancient mathematical manual. Its fragile pages presented real-world problems, calculating the purity of gold, weighing grain shipments, and dividing trading profits fairly. Yet for over a century, no one knew its true age. For generations, the oldest verified Indian 0 had come from a stone temple wall in Gwalior, India, carved around the year 876 CE. Most historians assume the written concept began around that era. Then, in 2017, researchers at Oxford examined the birch bark using radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon dating is a scientific method that measures carbon atoms to determine the age of ancient organic materials. The test results startled the academic world. The oldest sections of the Bakhshali bark dated between 224 and 383 CE. That meant the writing was 5 centuries older than the temple carving at Gwalior. Under a microscope, the ancient pages reveal something remarkable. Scattered between rows of numbers, resting in open spaces, sit small, solid black dots. In ancient Sanskrit, this dot was called shunya. Shunya means empty, void, or nothing. In this early text, the dot served as an essential placeholder. If an accountant wrote 302, the dark dot rested between the 3 and the 2. It warned the reader that the middle column held no value. Without that dot, someone might easily read the amount as 32, causing costly confusion. Human thought had crossed a major threshold. Scribes had given nothingness a visible mark. Yet a simple dot was only the first step. A placeholder keeps a seat warm on a page, but it possesses no strength of its own. How do you add nothing to an existing quantity? What happens when you subtract 5 from 0? To transform this humble dot into a working engine of mathematics, the world needed an astronomer willing to give nothingness its own binding laws. That thinker was Brahmagupta. Living in western India during the 7th century, Brahmagupta spent his life studying the sky. An astronomer is a scientist who observes the sun, the moon, and the movement of distant stars. Night after night, Brahmagupta tracked planets across the dark Indian sky. Plotting their courses required exact calculations. He needed a number system that produced reliable results every time, without ambiguity. In the year 628 CE, at the age of 30, Brahmagupta completed a landmark text called the Brahmasfuta Siddhanta. That Sanskrit title translates to the corrected treatise of Brahma. A treatise is a formal, detailed book written by an expert to explain a complex subject clearly. Within those pages, Brahmagupta took a step no Greek philosopher, Roman engineer, or Egyptian builder had ever taken. He looked at that empty space, that plain black dot, and made it a full citizen in the kingdom of numbers. Before him, people viewed 0 simply as an absence, like an empty slot on an abacus or a blank line on a tablet. Brahmagupta changed that perspective. He declared that 0 was an independent number, with its own distinct behavior and mathematical laws. He set down these principles in clear Sanskrit verse, explaining what happens when 0 interacts with other values. First, he established addition. When you add 0 to any number, the value does not change. Place 5 mangoes in an empty basket and add 0 mangoes, and 5 mangoes remain. 5 plus 0 is 5. Next came subtraction. Take 0 away from a number, and that number stays untouched. If 8 cattle stand in a pasture, and you remove 0 cattle, 8 still stand there. 8 minus 0 equals 8. Then he addressed multiplication. When you multiply any value by 0, the entire quantity dissolves into 0. 10 multiplied by 0 is 0. 1,000 times 0 remains 0. These principles feel natural to us because we learned them as children. In 628 CE, they were radical. For thousands of years, scholars believed numbers could only represent tangible objects. Stones you could hold, loaves of bread you could weigh, or sheep you could herd. How could anyone count what was not physically there? Brahmagupta answered with calm, practical logic. Nothingness, he showed, could be measured, calculated, and organized just like any physical good. He did not stop with basic arithmetic. Once 0 became an active number, another puzzle appeared. What happens when you subtract a larger amount from a smaller one? What remains when you take 5 away from 0? To classical Western minds, taking 5 from 0 was impossible nonsense. You could not hold less than an empty hand. If your basket had no fruit, you could not pull 5 apples from the bottom. Western mathematics was rooted in physical shapes and geometry, and a line could never measure less than 0. Brahmagupta viewed numbers through a wider lens. He understood that mathematics was not just about physical piles of grain, it was about relationships, trade, and promises. To explain values that fall below 0, he turned to concepts every market trader dealt with daily: fortunes and debts. He defined positive numbers as fortunes. A fortune is the actual wealth, money, or property you own. He defined negative numbers as debts. A debt is money you borrow from someone else and must eventually pay back. With that everyday comparison, the territory below zero became clear. Suppose you have no coins in your pocket, your balance is zero. If you borrow 5 silver coins from a neighbor to buy grain, you do not possess 5 coins of wealth. You carry a debt of 5. Today, we write that balance as -5. You stand 5 steps below zero. When you work the following day and earn 5 silver coins, you hand them to your neighbor. Your debt disappears. You stand back at zero. If you earn 10 coins instead, you pay the 5 you owe and keep 5 for yourself. 5 below zero plus 10 brings you to 5 above zero. Brahmagupta organized these interactions into clear, systematic rules. A fortune minus zero remains a fortune. A debt minus zero remains a debt. Zero minus a fortune creates a debt, while zero minus a debt yields a fortune. He solved another mathematical riddle, multiplying negative values. Brahmagupta explained that multiplying a positive fortune by a negative debt produces a debt, yet multiplying 2 debts together yields a fortune. The product of 2 negative values is always positive. This was a major breakthrough in human thought. Before Brahmagupta, people only understood counting forward. Now, thinkers could count backward, step straight through the gateway of zero, and navigate negative space with ease. For accountants and merchants, daily business became far simpler. They no longer had to carry heavy abacus frames from town to town. An abacus is a wooden counting frame with sliding beads on wires. Traders no longer needed separate, confusing ledgers for profits and losses. A single sheet of paper could track every transaction, with zero serving as the quiet balance point between what was owned and what was owed. Indian mathematicians had assembled a complete numerical system, 9 digits, the zero dot, place value, and negative numbers. It was fast, clear, and immensely practical. Before long, word of this elegant system traveled along caravan trails. Traders carried these concepts over mountain passes and across desert sands, heading directly toward the intellectual heart of the medieval world, the city of Baghdad. By the early 9th century, Baghdad stood as a major center of global learning. Resting along the banks of the Tigris River, the prosperous city drew scholars, merchants, and travelers from thousands of miles away. A scholar is a person who dedicates their life to study and research. In the center of the city stood the House of Wisdom. The House of Wisdom was a grand library and academy where oil lamps burned late into the evening. Inside its quiet halls, translators and thinkers gathered to turn classic works from Greece, Persia, and India into Arabic. Among these thinkers was a Persian mathematician named Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. Al-Khwarizmi loved numbers and patterns. He mapped the stars, drew geography charts, and solved legal puzzles for local merchants. Around the year 820, an Indian mathematical manuscript arrived on his desk. A manuscript is an old document written completely by hand before printing machines existed. When al-Khwarizmi opened the pages, he saw something that surprised him. For centuries, people across the Middle East and the Mediterranean had used heavy counting tables or long alphabet letters to write numbers. Multiplying large amounts took hours of exhausting work, but here on the Indian pages were just 9 simple symbols and a tiny round dot. Al-Khwarizmi immediately recognized the power of this system. With only 10 marks, anyone could write 5, 50, or 5 million with complete clarity. You did not need heavy counting tables or complicated memory tricks. The small dot held the empty space, making sure every number stayed in its proper place. Between 820 and 825, al-Khwarizmi wrote a practical book to introduce this method to the Arabic-speaking world. His book was titled The Book of Addition and Subtraction According to the Hindu Calculation. In this guide, he carefully taught students and merchants how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide using the 10 digits. He gave the Indian dot an Arabic name. In Sanskrit, the dot was called shunya, which meant empty or void. Al-Khwarizmi translated this idea into Arabic as sifr, which also means empty. Over the centuries, the word sifr traveled through different languages, eventually turning into the English words cipher and zero. Al-Khwarizmi showed how these numbers could solve everyday real-world problems. Caravan traders used his methods to calculate prices across long desert journeys. Builders used them to measure land for homes and water canals. Judges used them to divide inheritances fairly under the law. His step-by-step methods became so famous that his own name created an essential modern word: algorithm. An algorithm is a clear, step-by-step set of rules used to solve a problem. Today, algorithms power the software inside every smartphone and computer on Earth. Thanks to al-Khwarizmi, this numbering system spread quickly across the Islamic world, bringing speed and logic to trade routes from Persia to North Africa. Accountants could finish in minutes what used to take days. Yet across the Mediterranean Sea, medieval Europe remained completely unaware of this breakthrough. European merchants were still tied to Roman numerals. When rumors of this mysterious empty circle finally reached their borders, many leaders viewed it with doubt and suspicion. Then, in the late 12th century, an Italian teenager named Leonardo of Pisa traveled across the sea. Today, we know him as Fibonacci. His father worked as a customs officer for the Republic of Pisa, stationed at a busy trading port in North Africa. In that port city, the young Italian watched local merchants at work. Back home in Italy, doing business was slow and difficult. European traders had to use a tool called an abacus. An abacus is a wooden frame with sliding beads used for counting. To record transactions, they had to write long rows of Roman numerals. Multiplying or dividing these numbers took hours of messy work on parchment. In North Africa, Leonardo saw something completely different. The local traders did not struggle with wooden beads. Instead, they wrote quickly on paper using 10 simple marks, the 9 Indian digits, and the small circle for 0. They solved complicated math problems about grain prices, shipping costs, and currency exchanges in just a few seconds. Leonardo recognized the immense value of this method. He spent years traveling across Egypt, Syria, and Greece, studying under mathematical masters. When he returned home to Italy, he decided to write a guide to teach this system to European merchants. In the year 1202, Leonardo published his famous work titled Liber Abaci, which means the Book of Calculation. On the very first page, he introduced the new system with great excitement. He explained the 9 Indian figures, along with the special sign called Zephyrum, or 0. He showed European readers how any number, no matter how vast, could be written clearly using only these 10 symbols. The impact on daily trade was extraordinary. Using these new numerals, merchants cut their paperwork and calculation time by more than 80%. They could easily calculate interest rates, convert foreign currencies, and manage large international shipments. This speed helped create modern bookkeeping. Bookkeeping is the careful daily practice of recording all the money that a business earns and spends. For the first time, Italian banks could track complex investments and balance their accounts with exact precision. However, not everyone welcomed this change. Some city leaders and conservative guilds viewed the new numbers with deep distrust. In Florence, leaders even passed a law banning Arabic numerals in official banking records. City officials argued that 0 was dangerous because a dishonest clerk could easily alter a 0 into a 6 or a 9 to commit fraud. Others worried that these foreign symbols carried strange, hidden powers. Yet the practical benefits were simply too powerful to stop. Italian merchants continued using the Indian numbers quietly in their private ledgers until the bans slowly faded away. Thanks to Fibonacci, Europe stepped out of mathematical darkness and built the foundations of international banking. But the journey of 0 was far from over. Centuries earlier, ancient thinkers had already connected 0 to another radical idea: a world built on just 2 choices. Around the 2nd century before the Common Era, an Indian scholar named Pingala studied the music of language. He was deeply interested in Sanskrit poetry and the natural patterns of spoken sounds. In ancient Sanskrit poetry, verses were built from short sounds and long sounds. Pingala named the short sound Laghu, which means light. He named the long sound Guru, which means heavy. He asked an interesting question: how many different rhythms can a poet create using only these 2 basic sounds? As he mapped every sound pattern into a structured sequence, Pingala created the earliest known version of a binary system. A binary system is a counting method that uses only 2 numbers or states to represent information. Instead of using 10 symbols, you only need 2 distinct choices: light or heavy, empty or full, 0 or 1. For many centuries, this idea remained quiet in ancient manuscripts. Then, in the year 1703, the German philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Leibniz made a fresh discovery. Leibniz was searching for a universal language that could express logic and human thought without confusion. When Leibniz studied arithmetic, he realized that every single number could be written using only two digits, 0 and 1. In his system, 0 represented nothingness, and 1 represented creation. Leibniz believed these two numbers together could describe the entire universe. At the time, many people thought Leibniz was wasting his energy on a curious game. Why write numbers with only zeros and ones when 10 digits were already convenient? For more than 200 years, binary arithmetic remained a philosophical idea with very few practical uses. Then the 20th century arrived, and engineers began building electronic computers. Early engineers faced a difficult physical problem. It was very hard to build electronic circuits that could reliably measure 10 different levels of electric voltage. If the power shifted even a little bit, the machine made a mistake. But creating a machine with only two states was simple and reliable. Electricity is either flowing or it is not flowing. A switch is either on or it is off. Engineers quickly realized that an electronic switch in the off position could represent 0, and a switch in the on position could represent 1. They began building microprocessors filled with millions of microscopic electronic switches called transistors. A transistor is a tiny electronic gate that opens and closes to control the flow of electrical power. Today, all modern digital technology relies on this binary foundation. Every digital photograph, text message, video, and web page is built from billions of zeros and ones rushing through silicon chips at the speed of light. The simple Indian idea of 0 did not just change how merchants count coins in a market, it became the heartbeat of the modern world. When you send a message on your phone today, you are using the exact mathematical truth that ancient scholars discovered long ago. When we look back at the long journey of 0, we discover a meaningful lesson that goes far beyond mathematics. For hundreds of years, people feared the idea of nothingness. They thought an empty space meant failure, darkness, or loss. Ancient scholars in Rome and Greece spent centuries avoiding 0 because they believed a number must always show something you can hold in your hands. But Indian thinkers looked at emptiness differently. They understood that an empty space is not useless. An empty space is full of potential. Potential is the hidden ability to grow, change, or develop into something great in the future. When you look at your own journey with the English language, you might sometimes feel like you are standing at 0. Perhaps you listen to native speakers, and the words move too fast. Perhaps you open a book, and the sentences feel heavy and confusing, like Roman numerals on an ancient stone wall. You might tell yourself that you know 0 words, that you have 0 confidence, or that you are making 0 progress. If you feel that way, remember the story of 0. Starting from 0 does not mean you have failed. In fact, 0 is the only place where every great journey can begin. A clean sheet of paper has 0 words on it, but that is why a writer can create a story on it. An empty field has 0 houses on it, but that is where builders can raise a new city. In the same way, your mind at the beginning of your English journey is an open space. It is ready to receive new ideas, new sounds, and new expressions. Every person who speaks fluent English today began at the exact same point. They started with 0 words, 0 grammar rules, and 0 practice. Think about how a single digit changes when you place a 0 next to it. The number 1 stands alone, but when you place a 0 beside it, it becomes 10. When you add another 0, it becomes 100. A third 0 turns it into 1,000. Each small daily habit works the same way. When you listen to a calm English story for 20 minutes today, it might feel like a tiny step, but tomorrow, you add another step. Next week, you add another. Soon, these small moments multiply. They build a solid foundation. A foundation is the strong base that supports a tall building or a big system. Your daily listening is the foundation of your future fluency. You do not need to learn every word in one afternoon. You only need to keep moving forward, one calm step at a time. Now, we would love to hear from you in the comments below. Which part of your English journey are you experiencing right now? Choice A. I am starting from 0, and I am building my very first daily habits. Choice B. I am in the middle of my journey, learning new words every single day. Choice C. I already understand English well, and I listen to these history stories for daily relaxation and practice. Type A, B, or C in the comments to share your story with our community. Thank you for spending this quiet time with Learn English Through History. Remember that every great achievement in human history began with a single empty space, and your journey to fluent English begins with the steps you take today. Keep listening, stay curious, and we will see you in our next story. The root of the problem was simple. Ancient counting systems had no placeholder. A placeholder is a symbol that sits in an empty space to keep other numbers in their right positions. Without it, writing large numbers became awkward and confusing. In the Roman system, the number 5 is written as V. The number 50 becomes L. 500 turns into D. The symbol changes completely every single time the quantity grows. The number 5 never keeps its familiar shape. Scribes had to memorize entirely new letters just to show larger amounts. To solve this, ancient merchants used counting boards. A merchant is a person who buys and sells goods for trade. A counting board was a flat piece of wood or stone covered with fine sand. The merchant drew lines in the sand to make columns. A column is a vertical line on a page or board. One column held single units, the next held tens, and another held hundreds. The merchant placed small stones in each column. If he had 5 hundreds, no tens, and 2 ones, he placed 5 stones in the hundreds column and 2 stones in the ones column. The middle column stayed completely bare. This method worked well on a wooden table, but it created problems on paper. When a clerk copied the numbers onto parchment, he had to leave an empty gap for the missing tens. Parchment is a thick writing material made from animal skins. Human handwriting is never uniform. Sometimes a clerk left the gap too small. Sometimes ink faded over the years. If a scribe left a blank space between the 5 and the 2, another merchant might easily read it as 52 instead of 502. A sudden breeze could sweep away the sand on a counting board, and a single faded gap on parchment could wipe out a trader's entire savings. Doing math on paper was nearly out of reach. Multiplying 84 by 73 using Roman numerals like LXXFE and LXXII was a nightmare. You could not line the letters up in neat columns. You could not carry digits over to the next row. Even the most educated scholars in ancient Rome could not do long division with pen and paper. Every calculation required physical pebbles and a counting tray. Trade slowed down whenever a counting board was not close at hand. Civilization had hit a wall. People wanted to build taller bridges, track long ocean voyages, and manage growing wealth. Yet their number systems could not support these ambitions. The missing piece was not a larger number. The missing piece was a clear, quiet mark for nothing. In ancient Indian markets, traders dealt with a daily challenge in their books. Sometimes a merchant held silver coins in his pouch. At other times, he sold spices on credit and waited for payment. If he spent more than he earned, he did not simply have zero money. He was in debt. A debt is money you borrow and must pay back later. Most ancient systems, including Roman numerals and Greek geometry, had no natural way to write down a debt. To those traditions, a number only counted physical things you could see and touch. You cannot put less than nothing on a counter. In the year 628, the astronomer Brahmagupta answered this riddle in his landmark text. He recognized that numbers do not just measure heavy stones or sacks of grain. Numbers can also describe two opposite directions of life. He called positive numbers fortune. A fortune means wealth, property, or money that belongs to you. He called negative numbers debt. A negative number is a value that is less than 0. In this clear system, 0 became the quiet center. It stood right in the middle, like a balanced scale. It was the calm point between what you own and what you owe. Brahmagupta laid down clear rules for how these numbers interact. If you add one fortune to another fortune, you get a larger fortune. If you add one debt to another debt, your total debt grows. But when you bring fortune and debt together, they balance out. If you hold 5 silver coins of fortune and pay 5 silver coins of debt, you reach 0. 0 clears the account entirely. Subtraction revealed something even more striking. If you subtract a fortune from 0, it turns into a debt. And if you remove a debt from someone, you give them a fortune. Taking away what someone owes makes them richer. Then came the most profound rule of all. Brahmagupta explained what happens when you multiply these values. A fortune multiplied by a fortune yields a fortune. A debt multiplied by a fortune yields a debt. But when you multiply a debt by another debt, the result is a fortune. A product is the final result when two numbers are multiplied together. Outside India, this idea sounded strange to ancient thinkers. Why would two negatives produce a positive? Yet in commerce, removing a loss from a ledger creates a gain. This straightforward insight unlocked mathematical equations that ancient Greek scholars could never solve. This system of debt and fortune transformed daily business across India. Scribes sat beneath shade trees with sandboards in their laps. They drew columns for fortune, zero, and debt. With a few quick strokes of a stylus, they tracked complicated trades, calculated interest, and settled long-distance contracts in minutes. Later, this understanding of negative numbers moved along trade roads into the Middle East and Europe. Today, this logic runs through every bank ledger, every balance sheet, and the positive and negative electrical currents inside modern computer chips. An idea born from market debts gave humanity the language to calculate the modern world. Look at how far this quiet idea has traveled. It began in the northern valleys of ancient India, where an unknown scribe inked a single round dot on fragile birch bark. That simple mark on the Bakhshali Manuscript showed that an empty space could hold real meaning. From there, it reached the courtyard of Brahmagupta in the year 628, where he gave zero its first true mathematical laws. He took nothingness and turned it into an active tool. Scholars in the grand libraries of Baghdad translated those Sanskrit texts into Arabic, preserving the knowledge for centuries. Later, a curious traveler named Leonardo Fibonacci brought those 10 simple digits to the trading ports of Italy, reshaping world commerce. Today, those exact principles operate inside every microchip, undersea cable, and digital screen across the world. A single thought born centuries ago now connects billions of lives every second. It is a lasting legacy. A legacy is something valuable created in the past and handed down to help the future. This history offers a helpful perspective for your own learning journey. A perspective is a calm and clear way of looking at a situation or understanding life. When you practice English, you might sometimes feel as though your mind is completely blank. You might listen to a quick conversation and feel empty, just like that ancient symbol of zero. It is easy to feel discouraged when a language feels demanding. Discouraged means feeling a loss of confidence when a task feels too hard. Yet history reminds us of a different truth. An empty space is not a sign of failure. It is simply the quiet starting point where new knowledge begins to grow. Without that humble zero, humanity could never have mapped the stars or built the digital world around us. Every time you listen to a story, learn a new word, or practice a short phrase, you are giving value to that open space. You are turning quiet daily efforts into genuine progress. Progress is the slow and steady movement toward a better result. Take a quiet breath and feel proud of the time you gave to your learning today. Your journey moves forward, one calm step at a time. Which part of Zero's long journey surprised you the most? Was it the market debts in ancient India, the scholars in Baghdad, or the Italian trade docks? Let us know in the comments below. Subscribe to Learn English Through History to build your English fluency while discovering the forgotten stories that built our modern world.